In the year 1241, an entire European kingdom disappeared in a matter of weeks, not because of disease, famine, or internal rebellion, but because it faced the most fearsome military force of the medieval world, the Mongol Empire. Hungary, a powerful and established kingdom, was crushed with astonishing speed and brutality. Nearly one-third of its population died, countless towns and villages were reduced to smoking ruins, and King Bailiff was forced to flee helplessly from place to place like a destitute refugee. A German monk later recorded the devastation with chilling clarity, writing that after more than 3.5 centuries of existence, the Kingdom of Hungary had effectively been destroyed. Yet history took a dramatic turn, because 44 years later, when the Mongols returned using the same strategies, the same numbers, and the same relentless determination to conquer, they failed completely. They were unable to seize even a single fortified city, suffered enormous losses, and withdrew in disgrace. The obvious question is what changed during those 44 years. What hidden force or strategy transformed a shattered land into an impregnable stronghold, and whether the so-called secret weapon was a remarkable invention or something far deeper about adaptation, resilience, and national transformation. To understand the answer, it is essential to first grasp the scale of the original catastrophe. In March of 1241, 5 separate Mongol armies invaded Hungary simultaneously from 5 different directions, a move that demonstrated extraordinary coordination rather than surprise. This invasion was a result of careful, long-term planning directed by Subutai, widely regarded as the greatest military strategist in Mongol history. Long before the attack, Subutai had dispatched spies across Poland, Austria, and deep inside Hungarian territory. He possessed detailed knowledge of the landscape, supply routes, political tensions, and military weaknesses of the kingdom. Most critically, he understood that Hungary was deeply divided internally. King Bailiff IV, an intelligent and determined ruler, had attempted to strengthen royal authority by reclaiming lands that his father had previously granted to powerful nobles. Although politically logical, this policy bred intense resentment among the aristocracy. Some nobles secretly hoped the Mongol invasion would weaken or remove the king, believing destruction would be limited and that they themselves would survive unscathed. This assumption proved disastrously wrong. However, political division was not Hungary's greatest vulnerability. An even more fatal weakness lay in its defensive infrastructure. In 1241, the entire Kingdom of Hungary, an area comparable in size to modern Poland, contained fewer than 10 stone castles. This astonishingly low number was not due to poverty or technological backwardness, but rather to deliberate royal policy. For generations, Hungarian kings had prohibited nobles from constructing private stone fortresses out of fear that independent strongholds would undermine royal authority and trigger feudal fragmentation or civil war. In times of peace, this policy preserved centralized power, but during the Mongol invasion, it became a fatal mistake. Most Hungarian settlements relied on wooden palisades, earthen ramparts, and shallow moats against conventional Western European armies. Such defenses were often sufficient. Against the Mongols, they were meaningless. The Mongol forces brought advanced siege engines capable of launching massive stones, incendiary weapons designed to spread fire and terror, and ruthless tactics that included forcing captives to fill moats with soil and corpses to create pathways for advancing troops. Contemporary chroniclers noted that Hungary possessed almost no cities protected by strong stone walls. Militarily, Hungary fielded an army estimated between 60 and 100,000 men, which sounded formidable in theory but proved ineffective in practice. Most of these soldiers were light cavalry, descendants of steppe traditions similar to those of their enemies, yet lacking comparable discipline and coordination. They had few heavily armored knights, very limited numbers of crossbowmen, and little experience fighting nomadic armies from the Eurasian steppes. The Mongols, by contrast, fielded approximately 80,000 troops, each a professional warrior trained from childhood. They wielded powerful composite bows with ranges of up to 300 meters, employed sophisticated tactics, such as feigned retreats to lure opponents into traps, and operated under the unified command of Subutai. The decisive confrontation occurred on April 11th, 1241, near the Sejo River close to the village of Mohi. On the previous night, the Hungarian army camped along the riverbank, confident that controlling the 200-meter bridge would prevent Mongol crossing. At midnight, a Mongol advance force attempted to seize the bridge, but Prince Koloman, Archbishop Ugrin, and the Knights Templar launched an immediate counterattack. Hungarian crossbowmen, though few, inflicted devastating damage in confined space, nearly annihilating the Mongol vanguard and forcing survivors to retreat or drown. Believing they had won a decisive victory, the Hungarians celebrated and relaxed their vigilance, unaware that Subutai had been observing the engagement from a distance. From this clash, he learned two critical lessons. Hungarian crossbows posed a serious threat, and the bridge represented a tactical bottleneck. He immediately revised his strategy. While Batakhan continued attacking the bridge with stone-throwing siege engines to fix Hungarian attention, Subutai secretly led a large force southward to construct a temporary crossing. At the same time, Bata's brother Shurban moved north to locate a ford. At dawn, the Hungarians realized too late that they were encircled on three sides. Chaos erupted as the Mongols unleashed early gunpowder weapons imported from China, terrifying horses and soldiers alike. Panic spread, men trampled one another, and formation collapsed. One Hungarian noble later recalled that more soldiers died beneath the hooves of fleeing horses than from enemy arrows. Subutai then executed his final and most devastating maneuver by deliberately leaving a gap in the encirclement. Desperate to escape, Hungarian troops poured through the opening, only to scatter across open terrain, where Mongol-mounted archers hunted them down in small groups with ruthless efficiency. Despite brave resistance from Hungarian crossbowmen, who inflicted heavy losses and nearly forced Batakhan to withdraw, Subutai persuaded him to press on. By the end of the battle, approximately 60,000 Hungarians lay dead, and the kingdom was left defenseless and broken. King Balafor survived the catastrophe only because his desperate bodyguards fought their way through chaos and carried him to safety, allowing him to flee as nobles. Peasants, monks, and bishops died side by side with no distinction of rank or privilege. Over the following year, the Mongols unleashed systematic destruction across Hungary, ravaging the countryside with terrifying efficiency. Between 50 and 80% of villages on the plains were burned to ground. Entire populations were enslaved or slaughtered. Irrigation systems were deliberately destroyed, and the resulting collapse of agriculture triggered devastating famines in 1242 and 1243. Hungary ceased to function as a coherent state, existing only as a shattered landscape of ruins, hunger, and trauma. Then, in March 1242, the Mongols suddenly withdrew. The traditional explanation claims that the great Khan Ogdi had died in December 1241, forcing Mongol princes to return east to elect a successor. However, modern historians have identified serious inconsistencies in this narrative. News of Ogdi's death could not have reached Batakhan in time to influence an immediate withdrawal, and Bata himself refused to return to Mongolia for the election. This raises the crucial question of why the Mongols truly left. Evidence increasingly suggests that Mongol forces were more strained than they admitted. Despite their victory at Mohi, they encountered stubborn and widespread resistance throughout Hungary. The city of Esztergom, the kingdom's capital, possessed a small stone citadel at its core. Batakhan bombarded it relentlessly with siege engines, yet the walls held. He ordered repeated assaults, but the fortress's crossbowmen, commanded by an Aragonese knight named Simon, repelled wave after wave of attacks. The chronicler Rogerius described with awe and terror how these crossbowmen inflicted severe casualties on Mongol troops. Similar stories emerged elsewhere. The stone fortresses of Székesfehérvár, Pannonhalma, and Klis all resisted successfully. At Klis, defenders rolled massive boulders down steep slopes onto Mongol soldiers after siege engines failed to breach the walls. Archaeological discoveries have revealed something even more extraordinary. Ordinary villagers dug defensive ditches around stone churches built on hills and used them as improvised fortresses. Excavations have uncovered hundreds of weapons and skeletal remains bearing clear signs of battle injuries, showing that common people resisted fiercely across the countryside. A modern historian has noted that this widespread collective resistance was far more significant than what contemporary Western or Eastern sources recorded. It is increasingly plausible that Batakhan withdrew not only for political reasons, but because he recognized that while Hungary could be devastated, it could not be fully conquered without unacceptable losses. In May 1242, King Balafor returned to a country reduced to ashes. This moment became one of the most decisive turning points in Hungarian history. A weak ruler might have surrendered to despair, and an ordinary ruler might have focused solely on rebuilding what was lost. Bela chose a different path. Standing amid ruins, he asked a harder question. Why had some places survived when nearly everything else was destroyed? The answer was unmistakable. Stone fortifications, disciplined crossbowmen, and heavily armored defenders had made the difference. From this realization, Bela made the boldest decision of his life, openly defying centuries of Hungarian tradition. In 1247, he wrote to Pope Innocent IV, outlining an ambitious plan to fortify the Danube, Hungary's most vulnerable frontier, with stone castles. Yet this was only the beginning. Bela did something unprecedented. He abandoned the royal monopoly on castle construction and permitted nobles, bishops, and towns to build their own stone fortresses, provided a pledge to defend the king when called upon. This was an enormous political gamble. Previous kings had banned private fortifications precisely to prevent nobles from becoming independent warlords. Bela reversed his policy because he understood a fundamental truth. It was better to rule a strong kingdom with powerful nobles than to be a weak king ruling over ruins. He trusted that the Mongol threat was so overwhelming it would unite Hungary rather than fracture it. He was correct. The results were astonishing. Within the first decade, 44 new stone castles were constructed. By the end of Bela's reign, the number approached 100. Modern research estimates that between 147 and 172 new fortifications were built between 1242 and 1300. Hungary transformed from a land with barely 10 stone castles into a vast defensive network filled with fortified strongpoints. Bela also restructured the military itself. In 1248, he issued a decree allowing members of the middle class to serve nobles and receive land grants on condition that they fight fully armored in the royal army. This was revolutionary. Hungary deliberately shifted away from reliance on light cavalry toward heavily armored knights modeled on Western European warfare. In 1247, Bela signed an agreement with the Knights of St. John, granting them southeastern borderlands in exchange for building fortresses and training armored cavalry. Most critically, in 1259, he requested papal assistance to connect him with Venice, so he could hire at least 1,000 professional crossbowmen. Crossbowmen were essential for 3 reasons. First, heavy European crossbows often outranged Mongol composite bows, reaching distances of 350 to 400 meters. Second, their bolts possessed superior armor penetration, capable of piercing Mongol leather and wooden armor at long range. Third, crossbows required far less training than traditional archery, allowing peasants to become effective soldiers within weeks. This was vital for rebuilding an army quickly. Yet the greatest strength of the crossbow lay not in open battle, but in fortress defense. Bela understood Hungary could never defeat the Mongols through mobile warfare on open plains. However, from behind thick stone walls, firing through narrow arrow slits, crossbowmen could strike while remaining almost invulnerable. The Mongols, masters of mobility and mounted archery, would be neutralized by this defensive system. Bela also transformed urban life. In 1248, he relocated the population of peasants in the plains to a hill across the Danube, where they built a new fortified city known as Buda. Within 2 decades, Buda became Hungary's most important commercial and political center. Bela granted self-governing privileges to more than 20 towns, encouraging them to erect stone walls and organize their own defenses. Perhaps his most profound reform, however, was psychological rather than military. Bela invited thousands of immigrants from Germany, Poland, and Italy to repopulate devastated lands. He promised them conditional nobility if they would serve as armored mounted warriors when called upon. This created a new social contract in which the state provided land, protection, and status, while the people offered loyalty and military service toward a single purpose, ensuring that the catastrophe of 1241 would never happen again. Bela ultimately became known as Hungary's second founder, not because he created the nation anew, but because he rebuilt it from ashes with an entirely new vision of survival, defense, and unity. Yet the true test of his reforms remained unanswered for decades. Would these sweeping changes actually work against the most feared empire of the age? The answer arrived in the winter of 1285. Throughout the 1250s and 1260s, the Khans of the Golden Horde repeatedly sent ultimatums to Hungary. In 1254, Batu Khan demanded a dynastic marriage alliance and 1/4 of Hungary's army to assist in another campaign to conquer Europe. Bela refused outright. In 1259, Berk Khan repeated the demand, offering conditional surrender, participation in Mongol wars, 1/5 of the plunder, and exemption from taxation. Bela refused again. In 1264, yet another ultimatum followed, and once more Bela rejected it. In letters to the Pope, Bela explained that the Mongols had proven themselves untrustworthy for decades and that any agreement with them was meaningless. He knew with certainty that they would return. The only uncertainty was when. In December 1285, that moment came. Nogai Khan and Talabuga, two powerful generals of the Golden Horde, led a new invasion of Hungary. They deliberately followed the same invasion routes used in 1241. Talabuga advanced through the Verek Pass from the north, while Nogai moved through Transylvania from the south. They expected an easy victory. They remembered the broken Hungary of 1241 and believed that 44 years were not enough to change the fundamental nature of a people. They were profoundly mistaken. Talabuga's forces pushed into northern Hungary using traditional Mongol tactics of speed, surprise, and fragmentation of the enemy, but they immediately encountered something entirely new. Stone castles dominated every strategic hill, guarded every major river crossing, and controlled every important trade route. Talabuga attempted to assault Reject Castle in the Zemplin region and failed. He tried a formal siege, but his troops were constantly harassed by crossbow fire from the walls. Narrow arrow slits were carefully designed so defenders could shoot outward, while remaining nearly impossible to hit. Siege engines were brought forward, but unlike the wooden palisades and earthen walls of 1241, these thick stone fortifications refused to collapse. Contemporary chronicles recorded that Talabuga encountered immense difficulty due to the density of fortifications and failed to capture a single castle or fortified city. While Talabuga was stalled in the north, Nogai initially experienced more success in Transylvania. He plundered towns such as Regin, Brashov, and Bystritsa, settlements not yet fully fortified. However, he soon encountered the same defensive system. At the fortress of Torsberg, Sakeli defenders repelled multiple consecutive assaults. Even more importantly, Hungary was no longer fighting defensively alone. This time, Hungarian forces actively attacked Mongol units. Commanders such as Roland Borsa, Amadeus Aba, George Bako, and Peter of Saros, officers trained and promoted after Bela's reforms, led coordinated counterattacks, ambushes, and harassment campaigns against Mongol troops. These were not the lightly armed cavalrymen of 1241. They were heavily armored knights equipped in the Western style, operating from secure castle bases. Hungary's new method of warfare relied on a clear system. Castles as strong points, crossbowmen to inflict losses from range, and armored knights to strike when Mongol forces became exhausted or overextended. For the Mongols, whose strength lay in mobile warfare on open plains, this environment was disastrous. They could not lure the Hungarians into open battle. They could not take the castles, and they could not move freely through the land. Each passing day brought increasing losses from ambushes, disease, supply shortages, and harsh winter conditions. Eventually, King Ladislaus assembled the main Hungarian army on the western bank of the Danube, a large, well-equipped, and confident force. Talabuga saw this army and chose retreat over confrontation. Yet retreat through the Carpathian Mountains in winter, while pursued by a hostile local population, proved catastrophic. Sakeli forces ambushed Talabuga's army along mountain routes. Deep snowblock movement and discipline collapsed. The army disintegrated. In the south, Nogai also suffered heavy losses. Chronicles report that although he managed to carry away some plunder, he lost thousands of warriors. After 2 months, Mongol forces withdrew completely from Hungary. They had captured no fortified cities, failed to seize a king, and returned with minimal spoils and devastating losses. A historian later observed that the outcome could not have contrasted more sharply with the invasion of 1241. In that earlier campaign, Hungary had been destroyed in weeks. In 1285, the Mongols were repelled in months. What made the difference brings us back to the original question. What was Hungary's secret weapon? It was not a miraculous invention or a single superior weapon. It was a system. The first component was stone fortifications. Hungary expanded from fewer than 10 stone castles to nearly 100 within Béla's lifetime, and eventually to well over 140 fortifications, including major castles, town walls, monasteries, and small stone towers. This dense defensive network made unrestricted movement impossible for invaders. Each fortress declared that villages could be burned, but the land itself could not be taken. The second component was crossbowmen, not because crossbows were universally superior to Mongol bows, but because within fortified defenses they allowed even moderately trained soldiers and civilians to inflict lethal damage from safety. In 1241, Hungary had very few crossbowmen. By 1285, nearly every border fortress maintained professional crossbow units. The third component was heavily armored knights. These forces were not designed to defeat Mongol horse archers on open plains, but to strike decisively when Mongol troops were trapped in close combat, besieging castles, or weakened by exhaustion. In 1241, only the Knights Templar and a handful of foreigners wore full armor. By 1285, Hungary fielded thousands of armored knights, supported by Béla's new feudal system. The fourth and most important component was strategy. Béla understood Hungary could not win a war of attrition on the plains, so he refused to fight one. Instead, he constructed a layered defense. Layer 1 slowed the enemy through castles and fortified cities. Layer 2 inflicted casualties through crossbow fire. Layer 3 delivered counterattacks with armored knights. Layer 4 ensured retreat was punished through ambushes by local populations. This was not passive resistance, but an active strategy designed to make invasion too costly to sustain. In 1241, the Mongols destroyed Hungary at a cost they considered acceptable, but by 1285 that cost had become unbearable. And yet there was one final element behind this transformation that was less visible than castles or armies, but perhaps more powerful than all of them combined: collective will. Béla IV had turned the disaster of 1241 into a living national memory, not a forgotten tragedy, but a shared source of motivation and purpose. Every Hungarian understood that the Mongols would return one day. Every stone castle raised, every knight trained, every crossbowman recruited existed for a single goal: to ensure that the catastrophe of 1241 would never happen again. This is why the nobles who were divided and selfish in 1241 stood united in 1285. This is why ordinary people who had fled in terror decades earlier now fought stubbornly from behind castle walls. The Mongols were not defeated by a single weapon or tactic, but by the transformation of an entire society. The story of Hungary is therefore not merely medieval history. It offers profound lessons for individuals, organizations, and nations facing failure and seeking recovery. The first lesson is that failure can be a source of information. After defeat, many people choose denial, blame, or excuses. Béla chose analysis. He examined failure with the mindset of scientists, asking why some places survived while others fell, why crossbowmen proved more effective than light cavalry, and why the Mongols failed to take strongholds like Estegam from the ruins. He extracted data and turned disaster into strategy. In life, whether failure comes in careers, businesses, or relationships, the most important question is not why misfortune strikes, but what the failure reveals. The second lesson is that true system change requires political courage. Béla's most daring decision was not the construction of castles, but the abandonment of the royal monopoly on power. Allowing nobles and towns to build fortresses went against centuries of instinctive royal policy and created real risk. Yet Béla recognized that in a new reality shaped by the Mongol threat, preserving the old system would guarantee extinction. It was better to share power within a strong country than to retain absolute authority over ruins. Many leaders fail today because they cling to outdated models in a changing world, fearing reform more than collapse. The third lesson is that defense does not mean passivity. Hungary in 1285 did not simply hide behind walls and wait for survival. Defensive structures were combined with active counterattacks, ambushes, and coordinated responses. In life, active defense means protecting what matters most: health, relationships, resources, and values, while remaining ready to seize opportunities and strike back at the right moment. The fourth lesson is that time becomes an ally when it is used deliberately. 44 years between 1241 and 1285 may seem insignificant in historical terms, but Bela used each year systematically. The earliest years focus on building critical fortifications. The following years restructured the military. Later years emphasize recruitment, training, and refinement without pause. Many abandon ambitious goals because decades feel too long, yet those years will pass regardless. The real question is what has been built when they are gone. The fifth lesson is that preparing for the worst creates mental strength. Bela never deceived himself or his people into believing the Mongols would not return. He planned everything on the assumption that they would. Because expectations were grounded in realism rather than wishful thinking, panic never took hold when the invasion came. In life, blind optimism can be dangerous, but realistic optimism, hoping for the best while preparing for the worst, builds resilience. The sixth lesson is that the greatest legacy is not personal achievement, but the system one leaves behind. Bela died in 1270, 15 years before the Second Mongol Invasion. He never witnessed the ultimate test of his reforms. Yet the castle still stood, the knights were trained according to his methods, and the defensive strategy continued to function without him. He had created something larger than himself, a system capable of surviving its creator. That is a hallmark of true leadership. Not what is accomplished during one's lifetime, but what continues to work afterward. From the ashes of 1241 to the victory of 1285, the original question can now be answered. Hungary's secret weapon was not a miraculous invention or a single brilliant tactic, but the systematic transformation of society itself. Infrastructure, military organization, political structure, and above all mindset were reshaped. Stone castles, crossbowmen, and armor knights were merely physical expressions of a deeper decision. Hungary would never again be an easy victim. In 1241, defeat came from unpreparedness, internal division, and loyalty to an outdated system. In 1285, victory came from learning, unity, and adaptation. The Mongol Empire, the most powerful force of its age, was not stopped by divine intervention or chance, but by a people who turned pain into lessons into action, and action into a durable system. After their failure in 1285, the Golden Horde never attacked Hungary again, not because they became weak, but because the cost of conquest had become too high. Hungary had transformed itself from a vulnerable target into one not worth the price. That is perhaps the final lesson for anyone facing challenges today. You do not need to be invincible. You only need to make defeat too expensive. Build your castles, train your crossbowmen, strengthen your systems, and when the inevitable challenge arrives, survival will turn into victory.